Hey everyone, I wanted to gather you all here today so we can discuss the state of the Cougar in the Long Dark. Whether you love it, you hate it, preferred Cougar 1.0, or whatever, I'm sure we can all agree that it isn't perfect, but something that we all want to be great. So today we're going to cover the pros and cons of both versions of the Cougar, and then I want to talk about what I believe could be done to make the Cougar feel better to interact with. Before we dive into any of this though, I want to preface it all by saying that I do like the Cougar, and I'm constantly impressed by how much Hinterland cares about its players. Not very many game developers would not only listen to what their audience has to say, but also make the tough decisions to entirely rework an element of the game. So although I will be giving some criticisms, I want it to be known that I appreciate everything that Hinterland has done for the Long Dark community. First off, let's start by talking about Cougar 1.0. The Cougar was intended to be the epitome of stealth for animals in the Long Dark. This version of the Cougar was able to capture that feeling pretty well. For this version, the Cougar would only become active after you have spent a lot of time in one region of Great Bear. At that point, it would take interest in you and begin to hunt you down. Eventually, the Cougar would attack you and you would have a brief chance to turn around and take a shot at it, or even try to shoot at it after it's finished attacking. Finally, there would be a location somewhere in Great Bear that was the Cougar's den. If you found it, you could destroy it for a while with a couple of noisemakers, and cause the Cougar to be absent from the world for a decent period of time. There was one thing about this version of the Cougar that heavily impacted people's reception of it. Unlike all the other animals in Great Bear, the Cougar did not actually roam the world and instead functioned as more of a quick-time event. When you hear it hissing or growling in the distance but can't see it, well, that's because it's not there. It was just a noise that was triggered by the game. The Cougar itself wouldn't actually spawn until it went to attack you and would despawn after it's done attacking you. This made the Cougar feel like it wasn't really a part of the world for a lot of players, and while I never got the chance to interact with the 1.0 Cougar, I would have to agree with those players. Something else I've also always wondered with this implementation is, how does the Cougar even know you're there? Yes, Cougars are very territorial animals, but the Cougar's territory is all of Great Bear? Having one Cougar that had no set territory and instead hunted you across the entire island felt a little bit strange to me. The final thing about this version of the Cougar is that when the Cougar began to take interest in you, your HUD would notify you of it, and also let you know how long you have until the Cougar arrives if you're getting close to that point. I strongly disliked this because of how it counters what I consider to be one of the key design elements of the Long Dark, which is that you know nothing. In the Long Dark, you don't start with maps, you have to make them yourself, and even with those maps made, you don't get the luxury of seeing where you are on those maps. You instead need to remember your landmarks and how to find yourself on the map to find where you need to go. You don't know where wildlife is or when they're going to move without finding it out for yourself. The Long Dark has always, to me, been about building your knowledge of the world with your survivor. When you two first crash on a Great Bear, you are equally as lost as each other, and both need to learn how to survive together. Having this display on the HUD that tells you exactly how long you have doesn't make any sense to me. How and why would your survivor know that the Cougar will arrive in 2 days? That should be something that sneaks up on you as a player. You're minding your own business, living every day in Pleasant Valley like you normally do, and suddenly you hear a hiss that makes your blood run cold. Imagine how much more immersive that experience would be. It would require players to learn how much time they have in a region, and learn to plan around that instead of just being told. So with all that said, let's put the pros and cons together. The pros here are that it really did capture that feeling of being stalked by a dangerous predator. It was hard to kill, and very stealthy. The cons are that it didn't really feel like it was part of the world, its territorial nature didn't make much sense, and it handheld players too much by giving them a lot of HUD elements that break the immersion. Now let's talk about the 2.0 Cougar, which is what we currently have in the game. This Cougar is very different. First of all, instead of having only one Cougar in the entire world that would hunt you, there were instead Cougar spawns placed in most regions of Great Bear. This version of the Cougar has a certain amount of time before becoming active on Great Bear, which depends on the difficulty of your save. You would be able to recognize when a Cougar is nearby by hearing it and noticing scratch marks on trees and finding exceptionally ravaged deer carcasses. The Cougar would roam its territory and only leave to chase a scent or if it's stalking you. This Cougar has a very long sight detection range, and will begin to slowly stalk and approach your survivor. If you interact with the Cougar too much, it will expand its territory, we'll get to that in a minute, which is meant to increase the risk of even going anywhere near its territory. This version of the Cougar removed the den mechanic from the first one, and included it as an animal that actually roamed the world. But there is a massive issue, in my opinion, with this Cougar. More often than not, it kind of falls flat on its face when it comes to stealth. First of all, the Cougar is a very different color from a lot of the terrain on Great Bear. Like deer, it's a tan brownish color, but lighter color than deer are. This makes the Cougar very easy to spot from very far away unless it happens to be roaming an area with a lot of natural cover. But a lot of the territory areas for Cougars don't. so that makes them way too easy to spot visually. But they are also obnoxiously loud, completely giving them away auditorily as well. The cougar can be heard from ridiculously far away and makes sounds very frequently. This makes the cougar impossible not to notice, therefore making it impossible for it to be stealthy. Due to that, this version of the cougar is much easier to hunt, and to counter that, they gave it a crap ton of health, but that ended up making the animal just feel like it's more of a fast tank than a stealthy ambush predator. Another thing about the 2.0 cougar is that it never actually expands its territory. Instead, as you interact with the cougar, separate cougar territories will spawn in the region with their own cougar to occupy them. This is very detrimental to the design of the cougar in my eyes. Cougars are territorial and don't have high population densities, usually living alone. Having a single cougar claiming all of Great Bear like the 1.0 cougar was strange, but with a 2.0 cougar, you can have as many as 3 in a single region, which is ridiculous. That number means that some regions could potentially have more cougars than they have bears. The final thing about the 2.0 cougar is that, upon their arrival, you will always have their territories marked on your map with a cougar symbol. This is once again a moment where the immersion of the game is broken for me. As I was talking about before, so much about the Long Dark is learning the regions of the game and where wildlife might be. By telling people exactly where the cougars are all the time, it's once again hand-holding a bit too much in my opinion. I understand that cougars are scary and newer players might not want to accidentally run into one, but that is no different from a wolf, a bear, or a moose. This also makes the ravaged deer carcasses and scratched up trees completely pointless, as by the time you see those signs of a cougar, you've been hearing it scream at you for over a minute. I personally believe that learning those wildlife behaviors, patterns, and locations is a very, very important aspect of the Long Dark, an aspect that is basically completely absent from both renditions of the cougar. So, here's our pros and cons for the Cougar 2.0. Pros. Feels like it's part of the world, more realistically takes interest in the player when they interact with the cougar, as opposed to just appearing after some amount of time, and usually has more realistic population. The cons are, it lacks any stealth, behaves too much like a tank, can cause way too many cougars to spawn, and once again hand-holding the player, removing the need to gather knowledge on your own. Now that we've discussed both versions of the cougar, I want to share with you guys, and maybe even Hinterland if they see this video, what I think could be done to drastically improve the way the cougar feels for the player. And it could be done in just 2 small changes, and maybe even 1 larger one, that would fix all of the cons of both versions, while keeping all of the pros. These ideas all build off of the 2.0 cougar, as I think that one of the most crucial things is keeping it as an animal that roams the world. The first small change that I believe should be made is to drastically decrease the amount of noise that the cougar makes, as well as the distance it can be heard from. Cougars can be very loud, but actually rarely make any noise when left alone. They may occasionally hiss, chirp, or meow, but these would be fairly quiet sounds, and when a cougar is stalking prey, they make as little noise as possible as they completely rely on stealth to hunt. The cougar in the Long Dark behaves nothing like this, and it completely ruins the stealth of it as a result. By making the cougar far, far quieter, and extremely decreasing the rate that it makes noise, we make it so your survivor has to be lucky enough to see it in order to know that it's nearby. The second change I believe should be implemented is to stop showing players where cougars are on the map. This is something that players should have to learn through experience in interacting with the cougar. It feels much more rewarding to discover those things, experience them, and learn to adapt. Additionally, this change would give the territory markers, like the scratches on the tree or deer carcasses, an actual function. Before I talk about the bigger change that I think should be made, I want to run you guys through a scenario that just implementing these 2 small changes could create. Your survivor is walking up a road in Blackrock. They had heard about an old abandoned prepper bunker at the top of the hill by the collapsed mining bridge. They had no problem dealing with the Timberwolves because of their trusty revolver, and is nearing the top of the climb when something catches their eye. They look over, and they see violent scratches on a tree, blood surrounding them, and your survivor's stomach drops. They continue on a couple of steps before noticing a deer carcass a bit farther up the trail, completely ravaged by a fierce predator. That's when all the color drains from their face, and they know that they have accidentally stumbled straight into a cougar's territory. They turn around to try and run back and reassess a new way into the bunker. But as they do, they see a light brown tail flicking behind a nearby rock, and 2 eyes staring right at them. Imagine how amazingly terrifying that would be. It would recapture the feeling of running into a bear for the first time in an unknown place, and all it would take is those 2 small changes. As of right now, if you're even approaching cougar territory, you know it. because of how loud the cougar is and the fact that the map is marking its location. But if these changes were implemented and you could no longer tell until you were already smack dab in the middle of the danger, it would really capture that stealthy predator element, make people have to keep an eye out for signs of the cougar, and make remembering where cougars roam incredibly important. Before I talk about the bigger change, I want to say that I think that just those two smaller changes are more than enough to greatly amplify the cougar's place in the game. And I do know that what I'm about to talk about would be a much greater task for the Hinterland team to program, so I in no way want to make it seem like I believe that this is an easy change. But I wanted to discuss it anyways because I think it would make it pretty cool. The final thing I would do is revamp how the cougar expands its territory. When new territories spawn in a region, instead of spawning a new cougar for that territory, have the current cougar roam between the territories instead. For example, the cougar might spend most of its day roaming around its territory over here on the outskirts of Mystery Lake. But then, it'll begin to cross the map to the next territory, staying there for a while before moving to the next one. Doing this would actually make the territory expansion of the cougar far more threatening, as it not only causes the cougar's territory to actually expand, but it also means that you may be unlucky enough to run into the cougar while it's traveling between those territories as well. I believe that this would not only fix the issue where you could have 3 cougars in one region, but it would also make the cougar feel more like it's hunting you down. If you dare to get close enough to bother it, it'll begin to patrol massive areas of the region, silently, waiting to catch a glimpse of you again, and put a stop to you intruding on its land. I think that would be so amazing. And with that, I'm done talking about the cougar. Of course, all of this is just my opinion, and if you guys love the cougar as it is, then that's great. But I think that if these changes were considered and implemented, we may finally see a real stealthy apex predator of Great Bear that would strike fear into the hearts of even the most veteran of players. Thank you guys all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.